and welcome to Morrisson-Reeves Library. My name is Beth Hare. I'm the program associate here at Morrisson-Reeves Library, and so happy that you're here for this evening to celebrate Women's History Month. We've got a wonderful program for you. Tonight's program is made possible with the support of the Friends of Morrisson-Reeves Library. But now, without further ado, I get to introduce Sue King. And Sue is presenting in honor of Women's History Month on one of her areas of expertise, the women of Morrisson-Reeves Library, the first 100 years. So we're going to be treated by Sue's research. She is archivist, she is a veteran, a Navy veteran, but most importantly to me, I get to call her colleague and friend. So, Sue King.
All right.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Beth. So yes, this is actually a presentation that I kind of recycled from last year. I did pretty much the same presentation last year for the museum, and it was completely Zoom, and it was technologically kind of a mess. So I thought, yeah, we can do this again, and everything will be smooth here at the library. And I was very surprised at how complicated it is. So much more complicated because we get so many things going on. But I think we're set to go, and let's start. So, yes, this is for Women's History Month. So, a lot of Morrisson-Reeves Library's history was made by women. Now, certainly not all of it, but a big chunk of it, and so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I can get through most of the history of the library just talking about these four women. They are, in order up here, the first one there is Sarah Wiggley, who was our first librarian. The next one is actually Caroline Reeves, who you'll see in a second. Wasn't a librarian, but she was very influential. Ada Bernhardt is the next, and Harriet Bard. And in fact, you are in the Bard room, at least the people here in person are in the Bard room, named after her. One of those things that a lot of people don't realize if you haven't been around the library is that the first three librarians here cover 121 years of Morrisson-Reeves' history, because they served for 39, 42, and 40 years. So that's why I say when I talk about these women, this covers most of it. Okay, so to start off, we've got Sarah Wiggley. And Sarah Wiggley was born in 1830, and at that point, Richmond was still on the frontier. The first settler didn't get here until 1806, and so in 1830 it was still a very small town. Her father was John Finley, and John Finley is noted as sort of the first person to use the word Hoosier in a literary source. Okay, so the word Hoosier was obviously in common use at that point, but in 1831 he published his poem, The Hoosier's Nest. Now, he was also a newspaper man for a time. He was the publisher of the Palladium, which is our paper here in Richmond. He was clerk of courts for the county, which at that point was in Centerville. The county seat was in Centerville. So he was a very educated man, and he made sure that his daughter was very well educated, which, again, in early Indiana, that wasn't all that common. So for that period, Sarah was a very well-educated young lady. We don't know an awful lot about her early life. The first thing we really know for sure is that she married in 1854. And this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I suspect that it was a shotgun wedding. We know that she married in September of 1854. She was immediately moved, she and her husband, Benjamin Wiggley, moved to Newcastle, where he took up residence and started working for the newspaper in Newcastle, the Newcastle Journal. And her oldest son, named Roy, we don't have his exact birth records, but in later years, when he applied for a passport, he reported that he was born in March of 1855. So, 6 months after the wedding, here comes a child, the first child. Sorry. And of course, the happy couple is bundled off to another city, to another newspaper, which I'm sure her father had ties to other newspapers in the vicinity. So they lived in Newcastle for a couple of years. There was a second son that was born named Luke. In 1856, then, they did move back, and Benjamin Wiggley, for a time, put up his shingle as a lawyer. I mean, that was his chosen profession. But he didn't stay around very long. He only shows up in the newspapers for a matter of less than a year, and then he is gone. He leaves Richmond, never to return. Again, probably not a real happy marriage. He winds up in Kansas and is actually part of the Constitutional Convention that, brought Kansas into the Union. So he was very prominent in Kansas politics for quite a while, by 1859. In 1860 then, somehow or another, he left Kansas and went to Texas. Now I do know that his family, the whole family was born in Massachusetts, and they all emigrated to Texas, except for Benjamin. Around the start of the Civil War, he moved down to Texas to be with his family. In December of 1861, he's thrown from a horse and killed. So by that time, Sarah Wiggley then was a single mother. She didn't realize that she was actually a widow probably until after the war, because Texas was behind enemy lines. But she, is alone with 2 young boys. Now, I'm sure she was still staying at her father's house. I'm sure he wasn't going to turn her out. But she was looking for other ways to keep herself busy. During the Civil War then also, almost all of the women in the North worked to help the Union cause. And for most of them, that meant working for the Sanitary Commission. In the smaller cities like around here, I think this one here is called the Soldiers Relief Circle. I know at some point it was called the Ladies Aid Society. It had a lot of different names, but the bottom line is they were gathering materials, raising money to send to the troops in Union hospitals all over the war-torn areas. And as you can see on here, she was the secretary of the local organization. And as I say, they were part of the Indiana Sanitary Commission, which then was a part of the National Sanitary Commission. Okay. Now, Sarah's brother, John Finley's son, was also named John. He wasn't a junior, though. I'm not really sure why. He actually had a middle name. I've never seen a middle name for John Finley, the father. Anyway, so John Finley was one of the first to volunteer for the Civil War after Fort Sumter. He wound up in the 69th Indiana Volunteer Infantry, which was one of the regiments that was from Wayne County. By the time of Vicksburg, he was a captain in that regiment. And in May of that year, he was wounded very badly. The first reports that came back said that he was mortally wounded. But he recovered, and once they realized he was going to recover, the Battle of Vicksburg was basically a siege, so it lasted a very long time. And General Grant didn't have the resources to care for all of the casualties that he was responsible for. And Governor Morton, who was always known as the soldier's friend, he organized steamboats to leave from Evansville to steam down towards Vicksburg to specifically give aid to all of the Indiana soldiers who were in hospitals down there. There were telegrams that sent all across the state asking for volunteers, for nurses, and for doctors to temporarily go to Vicksburg to care for Indiana's wounded soldiers. And Sarah was able to, and I'm sure through the influence of her father, she was able to get onto one of those steamboats and go to Vicksburg to bring her brother home. And that's exactly what she did. And she was down there. I mean, the siege was still going on. I mean, the battle was still going on. It didn't stop until July 4th, the July 4th weekend. So she went down into a war zone to bring her brother back. So she was, and there's a whole story on that too, but she was basically under fire briefly. So they came back. He was recovering at home, and by all reports, he was on his way. He was looking forward to getting back to his regiment, but he took a turn for the worse, probably an infection of some kind, and in September of 1863, he died. And she wrote later that it was a blow that her father never recovered from. Her father then died in December of 1866. So, right about that time, this is the one of the notices in one of the newspapers. This particular one, I pulled this out because when I was working on the suffrage material 2 years ago now, this is, it might have got cut off, but this is one of the boats that actually Dr. Mary Thomas, went down to Vicksburg on. But this is just one of the several. I know there were at least 3 that I found in the newspapers, and there were probably more. And so Sarah got onto one of these boats, heading down towards Vicksburg. So in the meantime, a man named Robert Morrison, I'm not going to get too far into him because, he's not a woman. But he was a very prominent citizen, and in 1863, right about when this was going on, he decided that as part of his will, he wanted to leave Richmond, actually Wayne Township, a library. He wanted to build this library. And the thing was, he put all the provisions into his will, but he didn't want to wait until after he was dead. He wanted to start right away. And so sorry, I'm very dry tonight. So he purchased the lot on the corner of what was then called Broadway and Marion, and he built this building. The library itself was opened in the summer of 1864. Sarah Wiggley was actually one of the people who helped in the setup. So she was very involved in that. And she was one of the people who applied to be the librarian. But she didn't get it. And so on July 30th, 1864, the Morrison Library opened with the librarian whose name was Jesse Brown. But we don't count him, because just a few weeks later, he was offered the job of school superintendent, so he left and took that. And so Sarah then was hired to be the librarian. Now, Jesse Brown was hired at a rate of $400 per annum. How much do you think Sarah was paid? Any guesses?
100.
Half.
400. She was paid $400 as well. She got exactly the same thing that Jesse Brown was. So some people, I just always attributed it to the Quaker ethic here in Richmond. Somebody on one of my, when I did this presentation years ago, they said, well, she was the mayor's daughter. So I don't know, whichever it is, she was paid at a rate equal to the man that she had replaced, which, in 1864, that's pretty amazing. Okay, so the library itself, let me do a little bit. The library proper was really just one room, basically. This area right here on the north side, so the library was really just one large room. It was lined with bookshelves on the sides, and they had a balcony with a nice spiral staircase that we all know about. The south part was actually fitted up as a residence, and then there were offices, like the township trustee's office was in the basement. I think there was kind of a meeting room down there, but initially the whole library was just one room. Now, for the first several years of the library's existence, there wasn't a lot going on. It really wasn't a very big library. The first collection was only about 6,000 books. And it wasn't open all that much because she was the only librarian. And it wasn't like we have today. This was just the place where the books were kept. You didn't come into the library and hang out and read the newspaper. There was none of that. It was the place where you got the books. What you're supposed to do, the catalog, I know most of us are used to the card catalog, but there wasn't even a card catalog. What they had was literally a book that was published that had a list of all the books on the shelf. And you were expected to purchase this book and take it home with you. So if you wanted a book, you were supposed to thumb through the catalog at home, pick out what you wanted, write it down on a piece of paper exactly as it is in the book, and give that to the librarian. She would unlock the cases because they were locked, and then she would give you the book, and you took it and came home. That's how things worked in the earliest days of Morrison Library. There was a small expansion in 1885, so there was another building towards the back. But the growth of Morrison Library was pretty slow during this period. So now what we need to do is go back. We need to talk about the second person, the Reeveses. So we need to kind of go back in history and talk about, this is Mark Reeves right here, and this is his brother James. The Reeves family came to Richmond about 1823 from New Jersey. The father was a carpenter by trade, but he wasn't in the greatest health, and so the two young boys pretty much had to go to work at a pretty early age to help support the family. Mark actually wound up, well, early on, one of his early jobs was working for Robert Morrison as a clerk in his store that was in what we call today Greens Fork. I've even got this is a notice from the Palladium. So this is a list of, and I didn't do them all, but a list of all the authorized agents. So these are all the people who were authorized to sell the Palladium in all of these towns around Wayne County. So you've got Centerville with the old style spelling. And you got Washington. Mark Reeves is there in Washington. And again, Washington in 1878, I think, changed its name to Greens Fork. So that's how we know it today. Williamsburg, Economy, Newport. Of course, we know Newport is now Fountain City. And Vandalia is a tiny little town just north of what is now Cambridge City. Nettle Creek, I'm assuming that's Hagerstown. I'm not rock solid on that, though. But, so Mark Reeves is in kind of business in 1835. Hillsborough? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, Hillsborough, I think is Whitewater now. Mm-hmm. It was Hillsborough Pike going up. That was 227. Sorry about that. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so in around 1848, Mark and James Reeves leave Wayne County and go to the big bustling city of Cincinnati, Ohio. And they go into the wholesale boot and shoe business. They're very successful, but after a few years, James's health starts failing, and so he sells out to his brother and moves back to Wayne County. And actually what he bought the farm that used to be Robert Morrison's on the west side of town. So all these little connections. So Mark E. Reeves then remained in Cincinnati until after the Civil War. He was a very successful merchant. He was a leader in the city. He was a member of the Cincinnati Sanitary Commission. So I know that he worked with the folks here in Richmond on different things, advising them on different subjects relating to providing help to the soldiers. I have seen instances where he was sent out to inspect Union hospitals to make sure that they were okay and working well and whether or not they needed assistance. one of the really interesting stories, he had enough clout that early in the Civil War, Oliver Morton needed money. He needed cash fast in order to put armies in the field. And he had already tapped out all the bankers in Indianapolis. And he knew of Mark Reeves in Cincinnati and sent a telegram to him saying, I need $100,000, like today, to pay troops. Now the thing, it was right when one of the Southern armies was heading towards Cincinnati. So I'm sure that was an extra incentive. But Mark Reeves went out and in like less than a day found enough money with all the bankers. He had enough influence with the bankers in Cincinnati that he got $100,000 onto a train headed to Indianapolis the next day. And he was cited by Governor Morton as one of the main reasons that he was able to field an army at that particular moment. So he was a big shot in Cincinnati. Let's see. Now, he did have a wife early, when he was younger, named Juliet, but she died of consumption before he went to Cincinnati. In fact, that's maybe why he went. In 1849, he married Caroline Middleton. And this painting right here is the same one that's in the boardroom over here. But Caroline Middleton was actually from New Jersey, so they must have still had connections with family back in New Jersey. And Caroline and Mark then had two children. One was Mary Taylor Reeves, and actually that's her painting over there as well. So Mary Reeves, and then she married William Dudley Folk. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. William Dudley Folk was a very prominent lawyer. He was an author, poet, kind of, I guess, in the late 19th century, he was a Renaissance man, or like he liked to think he was. He was very involved in the Civil Service Commission. He was buddies with Teddy Roosevelt. So he was a very influential man, and he was, married to Mrs. Reeves, or Miss Reeves, Mary Taylor Reeves Folk. It's way too many names. But she's also, because we've still got her painting down here on the wall, she's obviously important in history as well. The son was named Arthur Middleton Reeves, and he was a bit of a scholar. He was a businessman too. He graduated from Cornell. He had a printing business here in town, but his first love was Iceland and Icelandic history. And so because he had the means, he was able to travel to Europe and to Iceland many times. He published his first book in 1890, and it was called The Finding of Wineland the Good, which is just a terrible title. But the thesis of that was that based on his translations of the old Norse sagas, that the Vikings actually got to North America before Columbus did, which today is common knowledge, but back in 1890, I guess it was still being discussed. So unfortunately, though, let me see. Oh, nope, get ahead of myself. So after the Civil War then, Mark Reeves retired. He came back to Richmond and he purchased a farm. At that point it was still called a farm. This is the 1874 atlas, county atlas. And so what you've got here, this is the railroad, this is Main Street, or rather at this point it was the National Road. Right here is Mark Reeves's farm. So for you locals, you might know this is the Hawkins farm. This is now Glen Miller Park. And this is what we call today Reeveston. After he died, and then after she died in 1911, the family at that point was all scattered to the other parts of, Chicago and Connecticut, and they sold it to developers and made a residential area. So, but in Reeveston, just kind of like today, it's a very, very swanky part of the city. This is a picture of what was called the Cycle Club, one of the early clubs in Richmond, ladies' clubs. It was called the Cycle Club because they took turns hosting, and so they would sort of cycle through during the year at everybody's houses. So that's why they called it that. But right here is Caroline Middleton Reeves, right in the center of it all. She's the queen bee right there. That is her daughter. I think this is one of the star wives. That's Stubbs. We'll talk about them in a minute too. But again, it was a very swanky, very upper crust kind of an existence. Now, unfortunately, Mark Reeves then died in 1883 of cancer, and in 1891, Arthur was killed in a train crash near Hagerstown. And it is the following summer, June of 1892, that Caroline, along with her son, her son-in-law, who is now acting as her lawyer, attended a board meeting. They called it a committee at that point, but she came to the board with a proposition. Now, at that point, D.W. Comstock was the president of the board. And her proposal was a gift of $30,000. Sounds great, but there were some strings attached. The first one is, add the name Reeves to it. Well, that's easy, sure. That's easy enough. She wanted also then to create a separate committee called the Reeves Committee, made up of 3 people, who would have charge of that $30,000. And whatever was left of that $30,000 would go into a fund that would be administered by these 3 people and then used for special projects, and which it was. But the kicker was this last one. This Reeves Committee would have some say in choosing a new librarian. Now, Judge Comstock really objected to this. He was fairly adamant that the will of Robert Morrison specifically said that this library is to be administered by the 4-person committee that I have established. And I guess they went round and around about it, and Comstock resigned from the board. It actually went to the circuit court. They had to get somebody outside of the county to look at it and make sure that it was okay. And they said, yep, it's okay. You can go ahead and do it. It's not going to screw up Robert Morrison's will. And so, in 1893 is when they started the construction, and the new library was opened in May of 1894. Now, these are sort of the same building. This is not an entirely new building. This is an addition and a renovation. It took me a while to drag out the Sanborn maps, which I have here, to see how it worked. So let me show you. So this is what the building looked like in 1891, and this is the new building. So you can see, that first square there right on the corner, that was that was the footprint of the building in 1864. It was added to a couple of times, but that's what it looked like in 1891. And so what the addition then did, it spread it further south into the next lot. This is where the stacks were. And added the big tower on the corner, which is very distinctive, Richardsonian, Romanesque, just like our courthouse. They were built right at the same time. Stone all around it. This is the bay window where the Tiffany window was placed. And of course, it's a little bit closer to the sidewalk because the entrance, instead of having an exterior steps, the steps were moved inside. So there was an entrance on the ground level, and you had to go up or down to get to the basement or the main floor. This is the reading room. And this, because this was an addition, this room itself was largely unchanged from 1864 until 1975. The basics of it was unchanged. Now, one of the things that was made possible by this donation was a boys and girls room. This is one of the things that Mrs. Wiggley had always wanted to do. She wanted to have a special place where young kids could come and read books, get books. But if the whole library is just one room, you really can't do that. And so this expansion made it possible to have a separate, it was called the boys and girls room at this point. So this was up on the third floor. As you can see, the shelves are shorter so that the kids can actually get to them. There are magazines on the table. You can't see it in this view. I've got a different view that shows that. This painting right here is Clear Creek. It was donated by Professor Bundy over at Earlham. And that right there is Clear Creek. That is the painting that is right here. Now, up until a couple of years ago, that painting was up in our children's department, youth services, excuse me. And, you know, I mean, it's a dreary looking painting. I mean, it is a Bundy, and it's a giant Bundy, but it's still not very, you know, happy. So it really fits better down here. But we could always say, you know, when somebody said, why in the world do you have that awful painting there? Well, because it's always been in the children's department. Always, until a couple of years ago. Okay, let's see. All right, so that was open in about, right, I think sometime in 1900. So the next family we're going to talk about then is the Stubbs family. Now, Louis Stubbs was a prominent lawyer, again, another prominent lawyer. He was, for a short time, mayor of Richmond as well. His wife, Emily, was very artistic. She did a lot of china painting, which was a big thing in the 19th century. This is their daughter, Edna, and she is best known, in fact, that's what she's doing right here. She's best known as the painter of E.G. Hill's patent applications. You know, every time Mr. Hill wanted to patent a new rose that he had just created, you know, it was before color photography, so in order to get the color of this new rose, somebody had to paint it, and that's what she did. So a very artistic family, very literate, very well-educated, and their other daughter is then Ada. Ada Luella. In fact, I've seen instances where she was called Lulu in the paper. So, I mean, yeah, whatever. Anyway, so Ada Bernhardt, she married another young lawyer in town. He, though, he was an invalid for some reason, became despondent. In 1888, he committed suicide. So we have another young mother with a child. She had a son. So actually all three of these women are widows with sons. The thing was, though, she was very, very well connected. I told you that she had the Stubbs family. Well, the thing, I think I did not mention that Reeves committee, that 3-person Reeves committee from before. On the very first Reeves committee, it was Caroline Middleton Reeves, William Dudley Folk, and Louis Stubbs. So going back here, this is that Cycle Club picture again. This is Mrs. Stubbs, Emily Stubbs, and this is Ada. This is the earliest known, at least the earliest I've seen of Ada Bernhardt. This is sometime in like 1889. And so she's right in here with all these high society, very well connected. So what happens then is, this is when that third condition comes in. 1903, Mrs. Wiggley, not a young woman anymore, and she retires. She's finally kind of forced to because apparently her eyesight has dimmed so much that she really can barely see. And so she retires. The board has to meet to hire a new librarian. Well, see, this is what this says, the meeting of the joint boards. So all 7 of these people meet to choose a new librarian. Now, most people in town just assumed there was a woman named Florence Robbins who had been at the library for 17 years, had been the assistant for many years, and for the previous 6 months had basically been doing the job because Mrs. Wiggley had been so ill. And everybody just figured, well, of course she's going to step up and be the librarian. Oh, no. No, this is when that third condition came into effect, and here comes Ada Bernhardt. Ada Bernhardt is named the new librarian, kind of out of nowhere. I mean, she was probably qualified, but come on. Then, of course, the very next day, Miss Robbins then said, "No, I'm out of here. Here's my keys," and she left town. And you can't blame her. I mean, to be completely passed over like that. So, all right. So, okay. So Mrs. Bernhardt then, she was, as I said before, super literary. She, along with William Dudley Folk, they were of the opinion that a public library was supposed to be the repository of all the good things, all the good books. You know, modern fiction, that's all just garbage. Sorry, I almost used a Navy word, sorry. But you know, anything that's new is automatically bad. And I don't know if any of you, I'm sure you've all heard me say this, that awful sonnet, it's cast in bronze up there, it's hanging out next to our back elevator upstairs. I mean, he wrote that, I think the occasion was the centennial of Indiana, so in 1916, and his wife had it cast in bronze and placed in the library. And basically what it says is, you know, you've got Shakespeare and Milton. Why would you want anything else? And that was his view, and of course it was her view too. She had actually worked as a literary secretary for him after, because I think, let me go back, I think Ada's husband had worked for William Dudley Folk, and then when he died, she took his job. So again, they were all very connected, and they definitely believed the same thing, that a public library should have only the best books. Now, who was to decide what were the best? Right. Yeah. In 1908, the Indiana Library Federation, whatever it's today it's the Indiana Library Federation. I don't know what it was called back then, but they had their state meeting here at the library. And one of the early presenters was William Dudley Folk. And his presentation was literally the disadvantage of a public library. Basically saying that, you know, not all books are good. Yeah, I mean, he's rolling over in his grave right now, and that's fine. I'm not a fan, if you couldn't tell. But, okay, but anyway, that was the mindset of Ada Bernhardt, who is the librarian. And so she created a collection that was very heavy on art, philosophy, religion, foreign languages. I mean, she was creating a library for scholars and not for the people of Richmond. And I'm not sure exactly what prompted it, but in 1914, the Commercial Club, which was sort of a precursor to the Chamber of Commerce, they hired a consultant to come in and see why the library wasn't popular enough, and they were trying to see what they could do to make the library more popular. And right there, too many art books. Nothing in the way of the municipal. Yes, they wanted a municipal department, which is kind of funny, but yeah, actually it said they wanted a reference librarian, which is awesome. But the municipal department is to be supplied with books that will deal with the questions of the municipality and will be intended to appeal especially to the business and working men in the city. This department is to be in charge of some man. Yeah. Okay, so that's in March. So she had kind of a, new books at Morrisson-Reeves column in the paper. And so in June, this is what showed up. Okay, so light fiction, again, fiction is bad, but okay, all right, you want some fun fiction that's not, Shakespeare and Milton, here's some light fiction for the summer. And then police administration, collection and disposal of municipal waste. This is passive aggressive book buying. She's just like, oh, you want municipal stuff? Okay, here's sewage disposal. And she had to be just gritting her teeth while she was ordering those things. So there was a little blip here in 1914 where she was buying books that anybody could get excited about. It didn't last though, because when Harriet Bard came on board, that was one of her biggest complaints, was that it was a scholarly collection. It was nothing that normal people would care to check out. I think we're getting to that though. All right. So Ada Bernhardt, she didn't really move the library forward too much. She kind of, the status quo. She did work through 2 world wars and a depression, which surely were major challenges, but she didn't really move it forward. Certainly nothing like the next woman did. So, 1945, Mrs. Bernhardt then health is declining and she retires. The board at that point, actually, they kind of stole her. Mrs. Bard was actually at that point was the librarian at Hagerstown. And Richmond kind of swiped her from Hagerstown. Now, she was somebody who was born in New England, so she all of her life she still kept that New England accent. But her husband took a job in Connersville, so that's what got her to Indiana. Then after a few years, he had a heart attack. So again, we've got a widow with a young child. She was the librarian up at Hagerstown, and then in 1945, this board hired her to come down and be the librarian here in Richmond. There was a lot of this stuff I'm getting from an oral history. In 1976, she did an oral history with Dr. Blakey. So, I am quoting her here when I say that this library, or again, the old library, was dark, dingy, very uninviting. When you walked in that front door, and I think I said before, you either had to go up or down to get to any place, there was nothing. There was nothing welcoming. There's nothing that said, hey, new books up here. Everything was dingy. She said, I guess at one point during the war, she came down with a friend who had to run some errands in Richmond, and she came to the library to spend a couple of hours. And she was appalled, and that was the word she used, appalled, that she was here for an hour and nobody said a word to her. So when she became the librarian, those are some of the things she wanted to turn around immediately. So one of the first things she did was throw a coat of paint on everything. Those were out of order. This actually, this was 1948. This was the children's room that was fitted up in the basement. Up until this point, it was in that third floor that I showed you before. This was a bigger area, and I think the reason they put it on the third floor in 1900 was because it was too damp down here, but for whatever reason they fixed that. And so this was, you know, bright coat of paint, new fixtures, and all of this was financed by the Reeves Committee. So a new children's department. Oh, and again, here's Clear Creek, the same painting. And the reading room. Oh, yes. So the reading room again. I think I had there was a picture earlier. Again, very dreary, dark, and now plenty of light. So that was the first thing she did. She wanted to get more people in, more professional people. One of the things that Mrs. Bernhardt had done was that she had the full-time staff was there during the day. Now the library was opened after hours, but it was just staffed by, anybody who could man a desk. Mrs. Bard made sure that there were professional librarians at all times, which we still do today. One of us is always here. We come in at 11 and stay till 8. That's what we do. But that started with Mrs. Bard. So one of the other things that Mrs. Bard did, and was a hallmark of her entire tenure here, was that, yes, we've got a great collection here, but we need to take it out. And so outreach was her big focus. And one of the first programs that she did was to take, they actually had to set it up. This was down at Smith Estep Hospital, which was the TB sanitarium south of town. You go all the way down south on 27, almost to Potter Shop Road. The building is still there, but it started off as a tuberculosis sanitarium. And so anything that went down there wasn't coming back. So it was a library that they set up, and she, had to get herself all kind of, it was still very contagious. They didn't know how to cure it at that point. So, so it was, she was the only one that actually went down there, but she did. And the folks down there appreciated it so much, and she got so much out of it. But that was the first thing that she did. There was a book cart over at East Haven that she helped man. And in the late 50s, early 60s, this is the Boys Club, which is down south of town. And that's Emma Andy, I believe. But there was a small collection down there, and it was a place where the boys could hang out. So there were books there, but there was, games and all kinds of stuff. So again, her job, or her intent on that was to show kids that the library is a good place to go. It's a nice place to hang out. Get them young, get them excited, and later they'll come in when they're adults. And that goes through a lot of her work. This is the Richardson Library at Townsend Center. And this actually started, this gentleman right here is George Bard, so it was Harriet's son who started that, but even after he went back to school, it continued. It continued into the 21st century, and I think we've just started it back up, I believe. Another program that she worked on was, when it first started, it was called Shutin Service. We later called it Homebound, because I guess it just sounds a little bit nicer. But it was a way of, connecting with people who could not come into the library. They would take books to people, to nursing homes, to their homes. Very, very low tech, though. Everything was done in a ledger. They just wrote everything out. One real quick thing about this. This was scheduled to start in February of 1965, but that is when the Richmond phone system burnt to a crisp. And since this was all phone-based, they pretty much had to postpone. So this didn't start until November of 1965. One of the things that everybody remembers is the Bookmobile. And we were one of the first in the state. This is actually in Indiana. This came from the state library. loaned to Morrisson-Reeves Library. This is the small bookmobile. This is the one that would go out to parks during the summer and out to other locales in the county. There were several different programs, but in some cases it was just a matter of loading up with a bunch of books, and in the summertime they would have interns or student staff go out and have story times with the kids in Dalton or Fountain City or Abington. You know, it would come at a certain time during the week and everybody would show up. They could check out some books, they could hear a story, play some games, and this is what they did during the summer. I think they also used this for some limited school visits as well. Let's see. So another thing, and I know we're kind of getting right into the 1964 cutoff, but this is taken in 1964 at the centennial of Morrisson-Reeves Library. And this really is an illustration. I put this up here because I wanted to talk about one of her really significant measures. Very soon after she came, she wanted to hire black staff, African Americans. And so I want to say 1947, so very soon after she arrived. Mrs. Potter, this is Maxine Potter here, she was the first to be hired, and Emma Andy was soon after. And she was very proactive about hiring African Americans in clerical jobs, and when possible, I mean, later on there was a student from Earlham who graduated and was a professional librarian. I mean, she went off to school, but she was here for a while. And one of the things, it's terrible. One of the hallmarks, before Carol McKee got here in 1985, they were all very formal. And the reason for that was, and the way Mrs. Bard put it in her talk, was that people, you know, the very proper ladies here in town, would never think of calling her Harriet. She was always Mrs. Bard. But they didn't have any problem calling her Maxine. And Mrs. Bard was having none of that. And so while everybody was in the library, everybody was Miss Brenner and Mrs. Thorne and Mrs. Bard and Mrs. Andy and Mrs. Potter. Everybody was a very formal title.
When I came here in the late 80s, Emma and Maxine were still on,
Yeah.
and went into the early 90s. You still had certain staff that always said Mrs. Potter.
Oh, I'm sure.
It was pretty much,
Yeah,
and
oh.
I think she preferred that. You still had some that would always address Maxine as Mrs. Potter.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Okay, so technically that's 1964 and that's the end. If you want, I've got one more slide that I can kind of talk to. Should I? No? Real quick. This is past 1964, but I wanted to talk about it because this is probably the biggest contribution that she made, is the building that we're in. She is the one who wanted to, she worked with the architect very closely. And that's why we have the spiral staircase still, the 1864 spiral staircase. We have all these paintings still. We have, you can't see them here, but these tables that were made from the floor of the old stack area. We've got all kinds of stuff all over the building. And that's because Mrs. Bard insisted on that. She wanted to make sure, she knew that everybody was going to be up in arms at tearing down this building. And I'm here to tell you, people are still mad about that. I sometimes have to post stuff on Facebook, and whenever I have to post a picture of the old library, I still get comments, oh, I can't believe they tore that down. But it was time for it to go. I'm not going to go into that. But the other thing, she was very forward thinking, is one of the first things on her list was a ramp to get up here. This library, you can see, there is no way anybody in a wheelchair is going to get near anything past the front door. And that was a big problem. Yes, you had the shut-in service, but there were people who wanted to come. And the only thing they could do was come in the front door and get somebody to go upstairs and get their books for them. And so to have a ramp where anybody in a wheelchair could come right in the front door and take an elevator to wherever in the thing, that was the first thing on her list. And this is in 1975, and that's 15 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act. So she was thinking ahead even then. Okay, that's probably enough. I've probably gone over. Yes, I have. I tried this.
Well, we're right. We are right at the hour. So I'm sure that if anyone has burning questions,
Yeah.
we might be able to convince Sue to stay
Oh, yeah.
around for a few more minutes and talk to us
Yeah.
about our individual questions. But
Absolutely.
I will close it here by thanking Sue for the wonderful
to.
presentation.
Okay.
Woo!
Thank you.
So happy to have such a thoroughly researched local history
Over-researched.
program. I have a question.
Okay.
There was a committee of 3
Yes.
and the Morrison Committee.
Yes.
And when did they merge, or how
They
did that?
merge. It was two separate things to this day.
So do they still exist today, 2 separate committees?
I don't know if it still exists. I know it did when I first got here, around 2000, but I don't know that it's ever met much since then. But they financed all sorts of special projects, renovation of the children's room in the 1940s. I got a whole file on it, but well, in fact, they were the ones who helped finance the purchase of some of the buildings in the rest of this block when they were tearing down the buildings everywhere else. Having to purchase all that land, the Reeves Committee did help with some of the financing on that. There were several other smaller special things, like I can tell you the big one. During the Depression, there were no tax dollars, right? And Bernhardt was going to have to, cut back on the hours. And in fact, no, it wasn't. It would have been the daughter. Insisted that they keep the library open because everybody needed a place to go. And the Reeves Committee financed all those extra hours. So they had this little pot of money that they used, kind of like the Friends now, I guess. They financed special projects.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.